Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm so excited to co-host tonight with Jean, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. And my dream one day is that we do this in person. But tonight, we're going to be talking about the March on Washington. And just to remind everyone, I'm sure everyone here already knows this because we're all here tonight, but it is Civic Learning Week. This is Civic Learning Week. I know at my school, we're doing a massive voter registration drive on Thursday in honor of this week. And I'm sure other educators in this space are doing the same. I'm super excited about that. But I'm even more excited, don't tell my students, but I'm even more excited about our discussion tonight. So I'm going to introduce the topic and Dr. Williams, and then Jean is going to introduce Dr. Long. So basically, we have two experts joining us tonight. I would say the experts, to the best experts to talk to us about the March on Washington. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their book. I hope you have like several copies already. I do. Their book that just came out. It came out in August. There it is. It's over there on my bookshelf. That's the one thing I forgot to do. I did brush my hair at least, but their book is called. Hold it up again, Jean. It's called More Than a Dream: The Radical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I remember you all talking about this with Vicki and me back in December of 2022. So it was so exciting to finally get it last summer. And it's an incredible book for our people our age and of course our students to read. And it's really just, I think it's such a great way to approach the topic of civics this week. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, I'm sure you're all familiar with Dr. Williams and Dr. Long already, but I like introducing them because it's fun for me just to remind you of these amazing humans that have joined us, not just one time tonight, but multiple times now on this program. So Dr. Williams is the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I've yet to go to St. Paul, and I need to come out there. He's a history professor of the civil rights and Black Panther movements and the former chief historian of the Jackie Robinson Foundation. Dr. William has appeared, I mean, you've probably seen his face everywhere. If you just go to history.com, he's there. But he's appeared on so many programs, I can't list them or we'd be done with the hour. Including History Channel and PBS. He also wrote a chapter in the anthology 42 Today about Jackie Robinson called I've Got to Be Me. And you've probably guessed it already. The book was edited by none other than Dr. Michael Long, our second guest with us tonight. And now I'm going to toss it to Jean to introduce Dr. Long.
Thank you, Sari, and hello, my friends. Good to see you. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Long. He wants to go by Mike tonight because we're keeping it casual. But Dr. Long has written several books and was a college professor for just as many years, if not longer. His work has focused on the multi-branch issues of social justice, including civil rights and the gay rights movement, as well as the incredible life and career of Jackie Robinson. Dr. Long is the author of multiple books about Jackie Robinson, and he served as an expert historian for Ken Burns's documentary on Jackie Robinson, which aired, of course, on PBS. His articles have appeared in most major news media outlets as well as prominent Black media organizations. We want to welcome both of you and our live audience, educator audience tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Sari, so she can ask the first question.
What I love the most about Dr. Long and Dr. Williams, or Mike, as he wants to be called tonight, is that they really go out there on the road to the schools, on the Zooms, to meet with teachers. I mean, we're all teachers, even if you're at the academic level, but meet with K through 12 teachers and librarians. And I just wanted to say, we're so grateful that you have graced our Zoom so many times now. And I just wanted to say that in case we ran out of time at the end. And I'm getting like emotional. So let's get started. Let's talk about the March on Washington. So my first question is, I mean, I'm just going to put this question out there, but I'm also low-key hoping that Dr. Williams or Mike throw up one of their legendary PowerPoints about this period. I mean, everyone's clapping, you know what I mean, but I'm trying to manifest that. But my first question, I think we all know about the March on Washington. I mean, I'm going to assume that in this room, especially. So we don't need to be like, tell us what happened at the March on Washington. We know what happened. But what's interesting to me is I'm a history teacher, and I often find that students walk in, not just students, but adults have some misconceptions about this march. And in particular, like I guess more generally, misconceptions about the civil rights leaders and activists who are part of this march and the ones that came before it, and of course the ones that came after. That being said, my first question is, what are some of those misconceptions that you've heard, and how does your book and your work debunk them?
So one misconception is that the leaders were all-inclusive people. And that's pretty common, I think, because, hey, Martin Luther King, right? Wow. Could anybody be more inclusive than Dr. King? But if you look at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom closely, and if you just look at the program, you will see that every major speaker at the Lincoln Memorial Program is a man. There was a woman walking towards the Lincoln Memorial during the march to the Lincoln Memorial. And she was walking, this is a young white woman who was a journalist, freelance journalist, and she was walking next to an older Black woman. And the older Black woman was lamenting the fact that there were no women in the program. And she had complained about this to her local leaders. And the white journalist had no idea. And this was something that she didn't notice as she looked at the program. And just to tell you about the influence of that moment, the young white journalist was Gloria Steinem, who became the founder of NOW and the leader of the women's movement. So even in their exclusivity that day, they inspired people to take that agenda from the march and build their own movements. So I think that's actually a hidden gem in the movement. Hoover, do you want to add to that?
I will, and I actually will share just very briefly a slide that looks at the role of women in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, which again, as Michael noted, is significant because this is what Charles Payne talks about in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, where he makes the argument that men may have led the movement, but women organized. And that organizational backbone or foundation of the movement was significant in so many ways. When we talk about the movement today, it would be difficult to talk about the organizing without talking about people like Ella Baker, Anna Arnold Hedgeman, or Pauli Murray, or a Rosa Parks will be more familiar, or even a Daisy Bates. So we think about the Little Rock school desegregation efforts in 1957. Rarely do people talk about the woman, Daisy Bates, who was the president of the Arkansas NAACP, who oversaw that important chapter in civil rights history. I mention that because even during the March on Washington, as women were excluded, you had news accounts like this one that Michael and I include in the book from August 3rd, 1963, where you literally have journalists talking about the significance of women. I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs to you here. The hand that rocks the cradle in the Negro race is doing a darn good job of shaking up this whole country, and I love it. I'm talking about our Black women. I'm addressing this column to the men of our race. This is phenomenal. So when we think about it in our contemporary moment, folks who make the case that Black women in the Biden election, the most recent election, played a significant role in saving American democracy. That's an echo of history that we see in this moment as well. So very important to kind of put a pin on that. This idea that women lead any crusade is another great article from the time by Joy Miller in the Washington, I believe this is the Washington Star, but it says, behind every man they say is a woman. Men called next week's March on Washington, but, says Dr. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, behind that march, women are a real force. Women usually lead any crusade. They don't always get front notice, but they're there and the force is felt. We thought it was extremely important to emphasize that for kids in this book and to recover those hidden stories of these important women who played a significant role in organizing the March on Washington, who aren't always credited, but they're there. And without them, there would have been no March on Washington.
And may I just add to that, say that during the planning of the march, the organizers decided that the male leaders would march on Independence Avenue, which is the main big avenue going towards the Lincoln Memorial, and that the women leaders would march on Constitution Avenue, which is the smaller one. I might have those avenues backward, but which is a smaller avenue on the left as you're walking toward the Lincoln Memorial. So even that was segregated by gender. It's crazy, but there you go. Anyway, that is one of the hidden parts of the march that people might be surprised about.
And since we're there, we might as well just close this off. I just want to share this with you too. Talk about interracial cooperation, particularly in our contemporary moment. You've got Anna Arnold Hedgeman in that same piece talking about this as not being exclusive. So I'm just going to share this with you. You might want to screenshot this for your classes. But women, white or Black, this is Anna Arnold Hedgeman, always carried the major responsibility for what happens. We can understand what we're, you can't really read that part there, during this time because they're suffering from this kind of duality of prejudice of both being female and also being a person of color. And I also want to point out that there are women who call this out, and one of them is Pauli Murray. One of the great things about Anna Pauli Murray is that she writes a letter to A. Philip Randolph as the organizer of the movement and to Martin Luther King, kind of calling out what she saw as a discriminatory practice of excluding women from a position of leadership. And this is what she says. Think about this notion of echoes again. August 21st, 1963. I've been increasingly perturbed over the blatant disparity between the major role which Black women have played and are playing in the crucial grassroots levels of our struggle and the minor role of leadership they've been assigned in the national policymaking decisions. It's indefensible to call a national march on Washington and send out a call which contains not the name of a single woman leader. Time has come to say to you quite candidly, Mr. Randolph, that tokenism is as offensive when applied to women as when applied to African Americans, to Black people, and that I have not devoted the greater part of my life to the implementation of human rights to now condone any policy which is not inclusive. I absolutely love that because in our contemporary moment, we talk about language like diversity, equity, and inclusion as if they're new. And yet the reality is here's Pauli Murray referencing that very language in 1963 to challenge those male leaders in the March on Washington to do the right thing. Because part of her argument in that moment is if we don't tackle discriminatory practice and all of its complexity against Black people, we're simply going to be back here in a couple of years having to tackle the same issue around gender. That's exactly what happened.
I know I'm not supposed to be talking right now, but you just hit a nail on the head for me because I was literally just saying to Vicky earlier in an email, we had this experience already. 1960s is like a parallel universe. And we had the experts that we're studying right now in history educate us on how to do this. And here we are yet again doing the same work, the good trouble work that we were doing 60 years ago. You want to talk about a cycle of dysfunction and abuse. But anyways, let me hush up because it's not my turn to talk.
No, that's perfect. And
Yeah.
I think and I think it works well with what I'm about to ask. And I think everyone can probably guess because I've been on this beat for a while. And I was just in Austin, Jean, for South by Southwest EDU. And I didn't make the connect. I was like, we should have met up. Next time I'm in Austin. And I was lucky enough to meet with a bunch of educators from the states, like out in places outside of Austin, and also teachers from Florida and Tennessee, and all these states that have fell victim to what they call their divisive concepts or CRT laws. And it's one thing to read about it. It's one thing to talk to y'all on Zoom about it, but to sit there face to face with teachers who, when I tell them about a lesson I'm teaching and they look at me and say, how do you teach that? Meaning not like, how do I teach it, but like, how do you get away with that?
Mhm.
And so, and that really, it got me fired up even more than I have been about this. And so, yes, I'm sure the March on Washington is listed in most states as something that you can mention, you can talk about, right? But I know that from talking to teachers, and Jean, you could probably speak more to this later, teachers are getting scared to eat. It puts a chill on even talking about anything related to the issues of equity, race, gender. I feel like there's a chill in those conversations. So I guess my question for Mike and Yoru is, what advice, and this is a tough one, right? Like I'm tossing a tough one to you, but what advice do you have for teachers right now to continue to teach these topics? Because I believe that they are on the list of things they can talk about, but how do you teach it without getting yourself in trouble, reported, etc.? Advice on that, or is that, I don't know. That's my question.
I'll let Uhuru take that one. He's
You
an
wanna go
expert on this answer.
Well, yeah, I'm a big fan, and we talked about this at a previous NewsHour Extra on January 6th, of teach by proxy, comment by proximity. And in fact, Jean just used the terminology around parallels, right? But I also like playing around with the notion of a multiverse, which our young people understand, right? So it's not quite a multiverse, but it's the question of echoes and how they influence the way that we see history. So for me, March on Washington, 1963, is intimately tied to the Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm going to be very concrete in the way that I talk about that. But I know a lot of school districts now have issues with teaching Reconstruction, right? You're not supposed to make kids feel bad. I can't teach the March on Washington. I can't talk about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s without referencing in some substantive way the Civil War and Reconstruction. Remember, the whole reason for the March on Washington in 1963 is it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's why that push takes place in January of 63. It's an echo of what happened in the 40s with A. Philip Randolph's call for a March on Washington then, but it's the symbolism of 100 years since emancipation that really becomes the kind of groundwork for, or the reason behind that call in 1963. It's also very important when we think about it this way, and I'm going to share my screen for just a second, that we also put ourselves in a position to talk about echoes in this way. I'm not going to play this video, but look at those signs from the March on Washington from 1963. What do they say? What are they calling for? I'm just going to read three to you. We demand an end to police brutality now. That's an echo. So in our contemporary moment, so I can't talk about police brutality, and I would get in trouble if I talked about George Floyd. Don't, but you have to talk about what those signs were at the March on Washington. I can't talk about voting rights right now, but you can't do that without looking at these signs from the March on Washington and then connecting that back to the 15th Amendment, 1870. So you got decent housing. The signs, the signage, the echoes from that moment give you fertile ground to be able to make connections without having to go in and say, I'm going to talk about police brutality today. I'm going to talk about the March on Washington, and in the context of that, talk about one of the 6 degrees of segregation that was particularly damaging and challenging to the Black community, and that was police brutality, which we see in any number of ways, but you certainly see them at the March. To be very clear that when I talk about this in terms of America's second Civil War, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, in the same way that we talk about the Civil War of the 1860s, in terms of major battles, we can also talk about the Second Civil War in terms of major battles. So when we do that, look at the symbolism here in the way that political cartoonists like Fred Seidel and like Herb Block, how they were depicting the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, both as a nuclear attack on the nation and also as an echo of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I mention all that because if we put these two up against each other, we teach the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the Civil War and Reconstruction in terms of major battles, major armies, major generals, right? You can do the same thing with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. Brown versus Board of Education, Little Rock, the Freedom Rides, Albany, 62, Birmingham, 1963. In the same way that we could talk about major battles of the Civil War and how they occasioned major pronouncements. Gettysburg allows Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. In the same way that the March on Washington sets the stage for the efforts to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm running through this very quickly, but I'm just trying to give you a sense in that time about how you could do that. The other or last thing I want to say about this, at least in terms of making these connections or making these parallels, is to think about it in these terms as well. Numerous scholars, from Peniel Joseph to Carrie Lee Merritt and myself, have suggested that we're now looking at a third Reconstruction. Now, immediately people say, well, I can't talk about that. But the reality is, if you can, Charlottesville feels a heck of a whole lot like Selma. And if I can't teach Charlottesville, but if I can create the opportunity for my students to think in terms of, you mean that those protests that were taking place in Birmingham were what led John F. Kennedy to make the pronouncement that civil rights was a moral issue? I'm going to share this with you again, just very quickly. People don't think about this, but the backdrop to this, to the March on Washington, is the campaign in Birmingham. And I just will go with you, June 11th, 1963, President Kennedy's address to the nation. What does Kennedy say? This is really powerful, because this is also, since we're in Civics Week, a comparison of presidential leadership. I take 4 presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Dwight David Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and I compare how they dealt with the issue of civil rights. I could also extend that in our contemporary moment, but I don't have to, because Kennedy's going to do it for me. What does Kennedy say June 11th, 1963? We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. This is powerful. Kennedy continues, the heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we're going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public official who will represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life of which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of their skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since Lincoln freed the slaves. I'm saying this to you because I don't have to do. Kennedy organically is setting me up with the history in the same way that our contemporary moment, in the aftermath of some issues in the last few years, you've had people make the same appeal to history. Nancy Pelosi in the aftermath of January 6th, or former President Trump in the aftermath of Charlottesville. I wouldn't lead with that, but I certainly can get there if I'm creative in a way that I think about primary sources. And it gives me this fertile opportunity to say, how far have we come? Let's look at some convenient signposts to evaluate that. And are we still trying to reconcile the issues that were present in those signs that we see from 1963 and 2024?
I love that.
That's the perfect segue into what I was getting ready to ask. And that's simply, do you think our present day leaders are literally untying the shoes of our nation right now? Because it seems like we're fighting for the things that we've already fought for. And every step of accomplishment, every step towards progress is now being undone. It's being untied. We're taking this shoe off of progress and we're saying, no, 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 let's backpedal. Because I look at the signs and your pictures, and it's the same thing that we're arguing right now to this very day, as you said, to a T. So, I mean, how similar is what's happening in 2024, 2023, 24, and what happened in 1963, 64, the mirror universe that basically you're seeing? If I, I don't want to paraphrase and quote you wrong, but you're saying it's literally the same things that we're fighting for. What progress has been made? Are we taking these shoes off again? Are we going to be fighting this forever? Is this like a yo-yo that we just refuse to roll back up and say we've learned our lesson, we've made the progress? Do you think that as what you're seeing, what you've studied and what you're teaching right now and witnessing, is it the same thing?
So I'm going to follow up with Uhuru's comments, and then I'll circle back to that and toss it over to Uhuru again, if I may. And so Dr. Williams is currently involved in policy discussions about reparations for Black Americans and police brutality and other issues. But you can't teach Dr. Williams talking about Black reparations, right? Well, you can teach about Dr. King. And Dr. King in 1957 traveled to India. He spoke with Prime Minister Nehru. And they talked about reparations that Nehru was making for what he called the untouchables in India. And it inspired Dr. King to come back, and he talked about reparations for Black Americans. And then you can tie that to Reconstruction. I mean, the connections are just amazing in history. And then fast forward to Dr. Williams. So John Lewis always said, don't forget about the progress that we have made. There aren't white and black water fountains anymore. There aren't elevators at the local courthouse that won't take black people up to register to vote. He said, don't forget that we have come a long way. But he also said, and don't forget that we have a long ways to go. And here I'll toss it over to Dr. Williams so he can talk maybe about some of his contemporary issues with police brutality and voting rights and so forth.
I love what you shared, Michael. And again, I'm going to do this for the educator. Somebody asked specifically about the March on Washington and Malcolm X's reaction to it. I think that what we have to do, and Michael spoke to this, Sari certainly, and Jean as well, is teach complexity. I love this political cartoon, which comes out a year after Kennedy gives that speech, talking about this as a moral issue. In it, after that, the longest filibuster in American history to try to prevent the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it shows a runner, but the last hurdle is public acceptance. Not public opinion, but public acceptance of these ideas. And that's really what we're still fighting. When I make that case about the Second Civil War, here's a great cartoon of Lyndon Johnson depicted as Ulysses S. Grant. And this whole cartoonist in this moment saying, repeated 100 years later. And so it's appropriate to then ask young people, if you're not teaching that social studies class, maybe you're teaching an art class, if you were to draw an image today, what historical themes would you play with or might you play with? The reason that Malcolm X calls it the farce on Washington is primarily because he saw no growth in that 100 years, according to the question that we had in the chat. I want to share just one more of these really powerful cartoons. After Lyndon Johnson's death, it showed Lyndon Johnson in conversation here with Abraham Lincoln. So I just like all these. And it's not because Johnson's perfect. I need students to understand the complexity. Here's a political cartoon that came out in 1964 that pointed to the fact that in 1957, Lyndon Johnson had opposed the Civil Rights Bill, had been a stumbling block, and actually had been responsible for neutering that legislation, which made the Civil Rights Act of 1957 all but ineffective in terms of addressing issues that African Americans were dealing with in the United States. Why the deep history? Why all the cartoons? Why all the documents? That's what we do. And the best way to stay out of trouble is for me to be able to weave that narrative in the context of those primary sources. So when the questions come and it's like, you were discussing this in your classroom. No, I was pointing to the fact that politicians historically have evolved on issues of race, forced to many times by challenges within the larger society, which are tending toward polarization, which create or highlight inequity, which are so inconsistent with our values as Americans that they have to be addressed. That's what happened with Lincoln. It's certainly the case of what happens with Kennedy and Johnson. And so it's a way for me to go, I'm not talking about today. I'm simply, why does Lyndon Johnson evolve, right? Why does Lyndon Johnson move from the guy who in 1957 says, we know how to kill this act, pass it, but leave it to the states to enforce it, which kills it, to the guy that says, we need effective federal enforcement of this. And so therefore, because that everyone knows was the fatal defect of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You needed, effective enforcement. And when you got that in the form of the Enforcement Act of 1870, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, the Supreme Court virtually eviscerated key sections of those protections in cases like U.S. versus Cruikshank, U.S. versus Harris, and the civil rights cases of 1883. And where are we today? I never have to walk into a class. All I have to do is set it up and then allow my students to ask those questions, which are appropriate. They'll see the parallels. But what I have to do effectively is to create the space for them to be able to recognize those. I also am a big fan of having students, particularly during Civics Week, journal and collect articles. One paragraph on articles that you're reading in the New York Times. We don't do that anymore. Now people say that they're political rags. And so I still do that. And I still do it because, number one, it promotes literacy. So when the questions come, why are you doing it? Because it's literacy, because young people need to read and need to know what's going on. And number two, because when they come across these themes, here's my opportunity to go back to where have we seen this before? How is this person playing with this history? Why is historical literacy so important in a way that my friend Liz Ramos, who's on the call today, talks about it. Why is historical literacy so important in that way? And I think you get to that again in a way that when the people with the torches come, and they will, here's my lesson. This is what we've been doing all year. Part of my responsibility is to educate young people to be functioning members of a participatory democracy. And that means recognizing these long-standing conversations and discourses about the fundamental nature of American democracy and democratic practice. Can't do that if I'm not dealing with the deep texture of these issues. Michael?
I'd like to get back to the question about Martin and Malcolm in the March on Washington, if I may. So yeah, Malcolm X wasn't supposed to go to the March on Washington in the sense that Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, had issued an edict asking his followers not to go to the March on Washington. And sure enough, that didn't happen for the most part. When marchers came off the trains and buses in Washington, D.C., there were members of the Nation of Islam handing out copies of the Messenger. So they took the occasion to evangelize in some ways. But Malcolm attended the march. At this point, he's sort of in transition, and he's thinking about becoming embodied in the civil rights movement. He's sort of in transition at this point. And he goes to Ossie Davis's hotel room, and he's an MC in Ruby Davis's hotel room. And he says, and this is the night before the march, if you need any help, which is to say, if violence breaks out, let me know, I can call on my people. The following day, he does go to the march, but before that, he attended a press conference in the Willard Hotel, which is where the leaders were meeting. And he denounced the march, and he denounces the march as a bunch of people going to a dead president's memorial and begging, pleading for their rights, which should have been granted at their birth. And so he also sees the march as a weakened down protest. He thinks that the leaders, and this is true, really watered down the protest because in its initial phase, it was going to be like a massive sit-in at Congress. And they were going to march in front of the White House. They were going to encircle the White House. And there were all these great plans. Early on, they were talked about lying down on the streets and at airports. So they had these radical plans in mind, and they tossed them out when NAACP leader Roy Wilkins and others came aboard. So Malcolm doesn't like that at all, but he does attend the March on Washington, which is really interesting to me. If I could ask him anything, it'd be about his thoughts at the march and what he was thinking about his own life and his own transition at that point. After the March on Washington, he calls it the farce on Washington because it was so watered down. Thanks for that question.
I just want to jump in because I want to connect this a little bit to Civics Week, and then Jean can ask your next question, and then we'll open it up to the group. I just want it because I think that what happens a lot is we underestimate how much young people are paying attention to what's going on in the world. And even though they might live in places where those discussions can't like directly be elicited in the classroom, I think right now, just hearing you both talk about the different people with the different political ideologies who were interacting with the march, some leading, some, like Malcolm tentatively kind of criticizing it, but curious. I think it's important. I think if there's a way you can connect this to kids and give them a sense of agency, is that I know right now because it's an election season, they're seeing different people running for office. They're seeing different people responding to the Biden administration's policies. They're seeing different, now they're all out of the running, but they were aware of the third-party candidates and their critiques of things. They might have even paid attention to the uncommitted vote that happened in Michigan. That was very similar to the percentage that happened with Obama, but it was something that was being highlighted by the media. And I think I think if you can bring up these stories about the different responses to the march, that not everyone operated as a monolith and just were like, we're marching and we want this law passed and this is how you do it. I think that will help kids understand, and they will, even if you're not talking about in the classroom, like I can connect it to the different political ideologies that exist today. I think that even if you're bringing this up, I think they can make that link in their head, and maybe even bring it up in class, and you can let them talk about that. So that I just wanted to throw that in and toss it back to Jean.
Okay, so that's the perfect segue because my question is about student agency. I am definitely a proponent of students not just complaining about what they see going wrong in society, but getting involved. And so when I'm reading this book, I'm seeing Senator John Lewis, rest in peace. He's 23 years old. He's in the power of himself. He's like me sometimes, labeled militant, even though I'm just passionate about what I believed in. But he was asked to tone down his radicalism. They were trying to put a muzzle on him. And he's like, no, 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 I'm going to speak truth to power. And so we had these kids coming from Gadsden, Alabama, that literally at 15, 16 years old, hitchhiked 700 miles to Washington, D.C. Can I just stop for a minute? As a mama, I don't know if I could let my 15-year-old son hitchhike with a thumb during 1963, knowing good and well what's happening and how volatile it is, and just being like, hey, baby, I got $5 on it. Get down there as best as you can. And I have to say this to my followers because those that follow me on social media, I tease this riddle out there. You guys, 3 kids, Gadsden, Alabama, hitchhike. They got there. They actually got to, speak to Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther King, and he had a message from their mama. So imagine hitchhiking 700 miles, going through the ups and downs and not knowing who you're getting in a car with, and you finally get to your destination. And not only are you welcome in and put to work, but you actually get to meet the mountaintop mecca of Martin Luther King, and he has a message from your mama. Now, you want to talk about the power of a mother's love to be able to still chastise and love your son through the mouth of one of the most renowned leaders of our whole movement existence of a nation, and you can still send a message to your son. That's beautiful in of itself. But at the same time, I would love to ask you as a panel, how did student agency play a mitigating role in More Than a Dream? How was the student voice, the student thought, the movement, the most kind of like, I would say, the catalyst needed for the March on Washington?
Hubert, do you want to start?
I'll let you go first, Mike.
Okay, sure. I don't think the march would have happened had it not been for those young students in Birmingham in 1963 who withstood those high-pressured fire hoses and the snarling German shepherds unleashed by the officers, the police officers there. I think because of their courage and bravery, they really sparked a movement in ways that it wouldn't have been. And so when there was a photograph of a German shepherd attacking a young Black student, that photograph went across the world. And the Kennedy administration was embarrassed, of course, but what it did was really energize the movement. And so people wanted to take that energy, and King wanted to take that energy and that momentum and channel it. And the march really became the perfect way to channel all that energy and anger and fury. So I think I would say that the kids, the students, are the ones who really made the march happen. I'll also add that sometimes the march is criticized as a really nice, lovely picnic on a really nice sunny day in summer. And people are sitting around and they're eating lunch and just having a wonderful time and listening to a dream. The students that day brought some radical thought and action to the march. And so they're walking around singing about police brutality, and they're walking around carrying signs about people who had been killed by white police officers in the South. The students that day interject radicalism into the entire event. The only other thing I think I would add is that Bayard Rustin and the other organizers of the march sought to tamp that down. And so in the directions for the march, they said that students 14 and under should not attend. And those 14 and over or 15 and over should be accompanied by an adult. How in the world could they issue that directive after Birmingham absolutely baffles me. Dr. Williams?
No, number one, I could listen to you talk all day, Michael. I guess that's why we're such great partners. I would say this, Gene, and it speaks directly to your question. There's a conservatism in the Black community that we often don't talk about, but it's important to highlight that in this way. And I don't mean conservative in a way that people are going to politicize it, but I mean in the sense that I want to protect my children. And I think the March organizers respected that and understood in that context that it would be irresponsible to encourage young people without supervision to come to Washington, D.C. And at the same time, as Michael and I uncovered, they're also very intentional about wanting to ensure that energy, that exuberance, wouldn't result in the fantasy of law enforcement in the District of Columbia, which you have the Kennedy administration and the local DC police who believe that DC is going to be overrun with kind of Black militants, that there's going to be violence in the streets. The irony is that that wasn't the case. If there was violence, it was always the other direction, right? It's not until Watts that becomes the reality that that was the fear that's always articulated, but that wasn't the reality. So the irony is that, that was one of the factors. But I think for young people in particular, what's important for me is that there are multiple ways to protest, and a March on Washington demonstrates them. My favorite chapter is the one on the militant bus of CORE, bus number 10 that's coming out of New York, where there's a debate on the bus among the more, people who would have been branded the militants, right? The extremists, who are, quite adamant and vocal in their reservations about this effort, but at the same time, who were there. So they're saying, in much of the way that Malcolm was, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm here. But they're also rejecting this kind of white liberal ideology that's happening on that bus, where people are like, we're going off to DC to protest on behalf of Black people. And the answer coming back on the bus is, no, you're going off to DC because this is immoral and it's wrong. And you're actually doing this to preserve American democracy and democratic practice, because the alternative is what Malcolm will end up talking about in April of '64 in the Ballad of the Bullet, right? Which again, people misread to mean that Malcolm is saying that, Black people are going to riot and destroy the United States, because they don't listen to the entire speech. Malcolm is saying, you better give, and we better ensure the strongest civil rights and voting rights legislation in this country, or the alternative will be anarchy. And no one wants that. Black people don't want that, and white people certainly don't want that. The thing that's most powerful to me, though, is that you've got young people in SNCC who, despite being marginalized by older leaders, do three things that I think are significant. Number one, they maintain their fire. And you see that in the book. So after the march, they're very critical of the march. Like, they go out and everybody's like patting themselves on the back, what a great job. And they're saying, John Lewis among them, this is what we hope to say. This is how the speech was censored. This is what we want people to know going out of that. We played nice with the established leaders because we respected Mr. Randolph. We respect our elders. But at the same time, what we had to say is what we had to say, and what happened on that day doesn't change it, right? The televised march doesn't dilute the message that we meant to bring, and we're going to share it anyway. Secondly, it is this kind of, incredible youthful energy that you see that then will be translated later on in ways that'll be much more legible to people in things like Freedom Summer. SNCC are the Marines of the civil rights movement, first in, last out, right? And so their critique of Dr. King, the infamous reference to King is the Lord, right? Where they say, the problem with Dr. King and this kind of messianic, charismatic leadership is that when Dr. King comes to town, everybody's in the movement. But when Dr. King goes, just like Christ, people are waiting for the second coming. That's how he gets that nickname. And they're like, we can't do that. We have to build indigenous protest roots so that those protests continue, or we're not going to have a long-term ground game, and that doesn't serve us. Their language and their style doesn't always appeal. And at the same time, by 1964, you see them rejecting the politics of respectability, because their argument is much akin to Malcolm. We played this game. We dressed up in nice suits, and we went down to the lunch counter, and we were bitten by dogs and sprayed by hoses, and we got legislation, and we continue to be killed. And so in a distant echo, it's almost like when they put on the overalls and they begin to grow their hair out and adopt a more militant stance, what we call militant, when they simply stop saying, I shouldn't have to be recognized as equal, dress a particular way and speak a particular way. My life matters.
Mm.
Yeah, I should be given respect in my hoodie. And I
Uh,
just got to say that for Trayvon. Sorry.
yes, yes, yes.
That's it. I mean, again, people go, Black Lives Matter is so different from, they are different movements. And yet at the same time, that's fundamentally that's the core issue that Kennedy asked in 63. I asked people to kind of look at this in this context. In Sanford, Florida in 2014, here's a kid that's walking to the store to get some Skittles, right? And he's confronted by the neighborhood watch captain and says, you don't belong here. How does he know that? Because housing remains segregated, right? So even at 7 o'clock at night, right? And then the instrument to ensure that is the invocation of privilege and authority that comes from being white in a society that is highly stratified on the basis of race and the ability to call the police. And then when that person is killed, there's no relief that comes from the law that rectifies that. Now, again, not going to teach that, but I am going to spend some time on that militant bus, asking
So
people to kind of deal with, exactly what Sari talked about. There's room within movements for multiple layers of leadership. There's not a right or wrong. It is just a degree of action and activity, and we have to respect all that collectively. As I mentioned in the office hours that my friend Liz was referencing, Dr. Ramos was referencing, Malcolm X's the March on Washington gives birth to 3 powerful speeches, 2 of which we are very familiar with and we never connect, one which we don't. Everett Dirksen's speech that he gives that finally ends the filibuster, which is very important, where he describes civil rights as a movement or an idea whose time has come. But the other 2 are King's I Have a Dream speech and Malcolm's Ballad of the Bullet, which is April of 64. So they all kind of work in concert. And I would say to people, lead with John Lewis in the beginning of the year and then strategically teach those 3 speeches. You'll be giving your students a hell of an introduction to civics in those for that one piece of writing in those 3 speeches.
I love that. Okay. We have not much time left, but I want to bring in a couple people. First of all, I want to bring in Chris, who you all probably know from hashtag SSChat. And I would love for you to bring it to Threads one day too. But I'm still on X, but yeah, would love it on Threads. We'll get there one day, build out history at Threads. But Chris, I back in the chat, you were making some cool connections or speaking about how to connect this to global history as well. So I'd love to throw it to you with that or anything else you want to say, because whatever you have to say is going to be brilliant.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, I was thinking about the connections between, I think when Dr. Williams brought up the Kennedy administration being very concerned about how this played internationally, the civil rights movement and the, lack of rights for African Americans and others, that international play made me think about today how we see other movements for civil rights, such as LGBTQ plus issues, and how that's playing out with very conservative right-wing leaders that we're seeing in different parts of the world, or like in Eastern Europe especially, and stuff like with Poland's former government, and then Hungary and with Orban, and then of course Putin in Russia, and how that's making connections to people who are concerned with the concern seems nicer than it is, with the progress that has been made. And so it just makes me think of how people, I think it goes back to Reconstruction, what was being said earlier too, about how that advances that are being made leads to these backlashes. And so I think that's another cyclical thing that students will probably be able to draw connections to. So it just got me thinking about that. I didn't really have a question so much, but I would love to hear it, other people's thoughts on anything like that.
There's a great,
That
oh, really quickly, there's a great clip, if you show clips from Eyes on the Prize, of George Wallace responding to the press's world press's critique of their reaction to the Birmingham protests and the way they were turning the water hoses on the kids and the dogs. And his response is not surprisingly extremely racist. I'm sure I wouldn't even want to play it on here. And I always play that for my students because, first of all, just seeing how the world is portraying the South and how the South is responding to that. And that, I think that's a really cool link for them to see. And then obviously bring it to current day and that dialogue that goes on between our country's actions and responses to other countries.
And the March on Washington is a pretty good entry point as well, in the sense that, yes, the Soviet Union at the time saw the march as a golden opportunity for criticizing the United States and race relations here. So you can talk about the Cold War at that point as well. And then I would connect it to the liberation struggle in Africa. King had, by this point, already visited Ghana and Nigeria as part of their independence celebrations. And Malcolm certainly was thinking about connecting the movement to the liberation movement in Africa as well. So the March on Washington is really a nice entry point to talk about global politics.
We have
I'll just add
yeah,
one quick thing.
yeah.
Oh, we have no time left. The idea of a global South, a global South. Post George Floyd, you had people like Robin Kelly and others who spoke, who wrote about this and talked about the. Chris, I know you're familiar with this, but for other people who kind of want to explore this, really powerful, this idea that, you know, as people were responding to the murder of George Floyd abroad, they weren't responding to the murder of George Floyd abroad. They were responding to global anti-Blackness. And what Michael was describing in terms of, you know, when King makes the case in the letter from Birmingham jail, while African nation and Asian nations are moving with jet-like speed toward independence, and we're still moving at a horse and buggy's pace, there's that connection. But then there's also the connection of there's apartheid in South Africa, and there are all kinds of what Garvey is speaking to. And so these are all, they've always been global, and we do ourselves a disservice when we don't do that. Even John Lewis, in that final piece that we've been referencing tonight, talks about the importance of developing a global consciousness so that we don't make the mistake of assuming that American exceptionalism means that other people are looking at the United States as a leader. Sometimes people are looking at the United States as a mirror and simply using it as a convenient way to say, and vice versa. The Soviet Union benefits from Paul Robeson and others. And I want to be clear here. It's not necessarily that they buy completely that the Soviet Union is a utopia, but they're making the right noises, and that's powerful propaganda against the United States. There's always the Du Boisian bargain that can go wrong, where you choose one, you compromise your values, and then you're hurt because you realize that you know, not only is the grass not greener, the hidden or more insidious form of how deep this runs is really what we have to work at collectively to correct. So long-winded way of saying, I love that point, Chris. This whole notion of global, but a global South in particular, can be very, very informative for young people.
Thank you for answering my question. I just wanted to say thank you so much.
We try our best here, Lauren. What can I say?
I appreciate it. I'm not a teacher, but I've learned a lot, so I appreciate it.
You know what though? You wrote something in the chat that you have a daughter that you're making. You wrote that a daughter that you're making sure you teach her all this stuff in case it's not taught in school. And I hope we get to a place where that's not a sentence that needs to ever be said.
Yeah.
But we are all teachers now. We're all joining together as educators because they cannot let us talk about this explicitly in some schools, but they can't go into your house yet and listen to what you're telling your kids. So you are a teacher. I welcome you as an educator too. I don't know if everyone agrees with me, but I think they do. Concluding remarks from, I don't know who wants to go first. Let's make it go. Who went first? Okay, let's go Michael and then Uhuru. But you can defy that order if you want.
I guess my closing remark would be, don't forget just how radical this march was. And the angle that I like to emphasize is its emphasis on economic justice. This was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. And so part of the march's demands was to ask for almost a reorientation of the economy, a massive program that would guarantee decent jobs for people and raise the minimum wage. And if you look at the figure that they were looking at and then translate it today, they were calling for $19 an hour in the minimum wage. That's pretty radical. And then the other thing that goes along with that is that if you pay attention to A. Philip Randolph's speech, and he gives the first speech that day, he sketches out a socialist vision of the economy. It's absolutely breathtaking. And I think it's the first time that many millions of US citizens ever heard a critique of US capitalism and ever heard somebody advocate for a different type of system. So as you're looking at the march, pay close attention to that. And then if you want to connect it to contemporary politics, look at Senator Bernie Sanders, who's calling only for $17 an hour, or the $15 an hour campaign that's still national. What's the national minimum wage right now? Nowhere near that.
Right. Very, very quickly from me, I am going to share an image, and that image speaks for itself. We have to talk about, if we're going to talk about this, these are Mike Masoka and Japanese Americans who were at the March on Washington in 1963. Part of, we talked about women who are left out, but we also don't talk about the other communities that join, because these are issues that at their core are about a more just and inclusive democracy. So it's reconciling a much larger issue. And then I recommend two books, Go Wilma Go, which is phenomenal, by Michael Long, which I just got a copy of, and actually bought a couple of more, just phenomenal. So if you're looking for books to do in class, and then Michael and I have a new book out, Let Us March On, which is on the silent protest of 1919. People ask me why we have moved into this area. Michael pretends to be a professor of religious studies and peace and justice studies. The lie, he's a historian. And why we've made this transition into writing young adult and children's books. And the reality is what Sari said in the very beginning. So that's the battleground right now. We have a duty and responsibility to continue to produce literature that speaks to young people in ways that familiarizes themselves with that history and is uplifting and continues the tradition of helping them develop to the highest capacity their ability to think critically. So I would recommend, if you're looking for good books for your classroom, Go Wilma Go. Phenomenal. Can't emphasize that enough. Michael's recent book on Bayard Rustin, if you're looking for some really, to supplement the Netflix, which is very good, but you've got to pick up that book, which is phenomenal. And then last but not least, just thank you to you guys, because you're on the front lines, period. You're on the front lines, and don't think that we don't know it and we don't appreciate it, because we do.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
Yeah. Jean, can we get Jean's concluding remark? Because as her fellow
Okay.
co-host, I want to hear.
I'll try to be quick. Number one, vote. Number two, get out there and support your librarians, especially here in Texas, because we are fighting for your right to read whatever you want, whenever you want. And last, thank you to Dr. Long, Dr. Williams. You inspired me. This book, I have an emotional connection to now, and I am going to teach, preach, share. And I would invite anyone, all of us are advocates. Even in the micro moments of a day, you are still an advocate. So I invite you to stand up, speak out, teach. I love that some of you are teaching at home, the gaps that are missing. Our public education system is literally on the front lines being picked apart. So stand up for the truth, go out and vote, go out and speak truth, show up at these school board meetings when they are banning books. Please, this librarian's heart is bleeding. I know that I am leading the intellectual freedom for my state, but I cannot do this alone. I need the grassroots, the parents. I need the organization that got 250,000 people to march on Washington. I need that kind of support. So if there's anything I could say, please get out there, use your voice, run for office. If we can put 18-year-olds in office, then we can put teachers in office too. That's all I have to say. I love you guys. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank Jean, my co-host, Mike, Dr. Long. I'm sorry, I'm just proper no matter what. Uhuru, Dr. Williams, for just, like I said in the beginning, for taking the time with us. Taking the time with us. And of course, to PBS NewsHour Classroom, yes, vote, stand up for public schools, because that's what they're bringing down, right? We talk about book bans, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are schools out there that never even had stocked libraries to begin with to have books being banned. I think we're forgetting that in this conversation. Like, I think it's important we talk about book bans, but I think we need to back it up a little and say there are teachers out there and librarians who never even had books to be banned. So I think we need to like bring the conversation back to that, and also fight, yes, we are all in the, there's more of us than the people who want to squelch these conversations. And I always leave these conversations reminded of that. And yeah, Civics Week. Let's educate wherever we can. So thank you so much, and have an amazing night, and vote.